You are watching Macro TV, and this is video number 7 out of 10 explaining the contents of Chapter 3 in Fourie and Burger. We're still busy with Study Unit 2, and we've talked about both the real sector and the monetary sector, and now we want to put them together into a new model called the ISLM model. Now, it's basically a graphical tool. It's a way of depicting equilibrium in the economy that's easier than it is when you use the Keynesian 45-degree line model, and you can take these three graphs and put them together into a single graph that shows equilibrium for the economy as a whole. Now, figure 313 showed an increase in government expenditure and what is the net effect on income, and you can do the same thing with the ISLM model in a combined fashion. So we want to analyze macro changes in the economy. The so-called IS curve depicts the real sector, all the components of aggregate spending, consumption, government spending, investment spending, exports minus imports. All of them make up the IS curve. Where the LM curve depicts the monetary sector, where the demand for money and the supply of money equals one another, that's where you derive the LM curve. In this video, we're only going to focus on the IS for now. So the IS shows all the combinations of interest rates and real income that are consistent with equilibrium in the real sector. So all the points on the IS line represents an equilibrium in the real sector. In the case of the LM, all the points on the LM shows the combinations of interest rate and real income that is consistent with equilibrium in the monetary sector. Now, when you use the interactions of the IS and the LM, it can be a way to analyze the impact of macro disturbances on the economy as a whole for both the real sector and the monetary sector. Now, to derive the IS curve is quite an important one. And we are going to be using the 45-degree diagram with the combination of investment and interest rates and use that to get to an IS curve. Now, I'll show you the graph next. In this graph, deriving the IS curve, we can start over here. This is equilibrium initially, according to our aggregate spending real sector model. So at this point, where the total consumption, all the expenditure components cuts the 45-degree line, you have a level of income Y0. Now, this level of income is associated with a combination of investment and interest rates. So I0 forms part of aggregate spending there. So I0 over here is associated with the level of interest rates R0. Now, the trick to deriving the IS curve is to say, so for this rate of interest R0, there is an associated level of investment I0, which is also associated with a macro equilibrium at Y0. So that gives you a point on a new graph over here at the interest rate R0 and the level of income Y0. That's a point in this space where you have interest rates on the vertical axis and income on the horizontal. And then you can sort of derive the curve by saying, let's say for some reason interest rates decrease to the level R1. That's going to lead to an increase in investment to the level I1, which, when it forms part of aggregate spending, pushes up the aggregate expenditure line. There you can see I1, and you have a new equilibrium at the level Y1. So the lower interest rate R1 is associated with a greater income level Y1, which gives you another point. Connecting the two gives you the IS curve. So that's why we say the IS curve are all the points, combinations of interest rate and income where the real sector is in equilibrium. Now, the formula for the IS curve looks as follows, and you'll see that it's filled with sort of familiar components. You'll see the exogenous components of spending is in over here. There's an exogenous level of consumption, of investment, of government spending, of exports. But you'll also see the endogenous components, the leakages from the circular flow. They're also there in the form of the tax rate, the marginal propensity to import, and the marginal propensity to consume. So that takes you back to the notion of the multiplier that you already know. Now, the properties of the IS curve is that it has a negative slope. You see that it's sloped like a demand curve, running from downward sloping from left to right. And the negative slope means that at lower interest rate levels, investment's higher and the equilibrium income is greater. So any move along the IS curve is associated with a change in interest rates. That's what you have on the vertical axis. The curve as a whole can also shift, and it's typically moved by changes in the exogenous components. So if exogenous consumption, investment, government spending, taxes that work via consumption, exports or imports would change, that would cause the whole IS curve to shift either to the left or to the right, depending on the kind of change. So if you have a look at this sort of move of the IS curve to the right, you can say the size, the magnitude of this shift of the IS curve depends on the expenditure multiplier. Now, that would make sense. So if there's a change in interest rates, which causes a change in investment, which causes a change in income, the size of that change would depend on the multiplier effect, multiplying the initial change into a change in income or output. So keeping that in mind, you also have to consider the slope of the IS curve. It doesn't always move parallel. The slope is also a feature. So the steepness of this curve depends on a number of factors that we've already mentioned before. Typically, how responsive is investment to a change in interest rates? And what is the size of the multiplier? You can see if investment is more responsive to a change in interest rates, the IS curve is flatter, and also the other way around. If the multiplier is bigger, the IS curve is flatter. Now, if it's flatter, as you can see with the blue line mentioned over here, then a small change in interest rates cause a big change in output. Of course, if the IS is steeper, the opposite is true. Then you need, or a small change in interest rates only cause a small change in output. Now, this video started us off on the IS-LM model, focusing specifically on the IS curve. In the next one, we'll talk about the LM curve and then put them together to have a go at policy analysis.